Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. And now to our show. Welcome back to another Dave and Dad episode of the Practice Podcast. Dave, I've lost track of the count on this one. I probably should have checked on the number, but it'll be the very next one that people will see. And throughout all of our episodes, we've been working in conjunction with our interest in the nature of practice itself as a human behavior, and of conversation, which is an interactive human behavior, and of the socially enacted outcome, maybe it's not even an outcome, maybe it's just the phenomenon of enaction, social enaction, which I think, Dave, you're going to tell us a lot more about today. Is that right?
Yeah, I am. I'm going to, because I've been talking about it in various ways in past episodes, and a little bit of some of the origins, but I was looking back and we haven't really talked about where the term comes from too much. Mm-hmm. And we also haven't talked too much about cognition, and
right.
There's a link where really what I'm distinguishing as social enaction has probably a wider and more current literature and also history in applications to psychology after it kind of moved from originally more of a biology perspective, if we're talking about self-organization. So I'm going to kind of focus on that, and going to try something new for our YouTube viewers, where I have a slideshow, which may just make it more boring, but
I don't think so.
We'll see. Since I've been doing nothing but presentations, I might as well go whole hog and have slides, but try to make it a little more visual that way. But otherwise, it's a way of having my notes in front of me.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your preparation each time. And each time, folks, Dave will pinpoint some aspect of what he feels is a related theory, and the theorist who created those theories. I think it gives our search for the meaning and nature of practice a great amount of panache, if anything else. I don't know anyone else has done this when they're trying to feature something like conversation, which is the root to my understanding of practice. So yeah, let's go academic in the best sense of the word, since both of us are academicians, and take us through it, Dave.
Okay. All right. There'll be a little bit of a pause.
You're going to go right to your slides.
Go to our slides.
Okay.
And okay. So again, I wanted to kind of I've brought in neuropsychology and neurophysiology, some other aspects of that level of psychology into our discussions in the past, and also the framework of social psychology, especially involving the pragmatist philosopher George Herbert Mead, from his work around the turn of the 20th century. But I wanted to kind of bring a few more theories and history and up-to-date things regarding cognition and cognitive science, cognitive psychology, which is its own big field, tends to be more experimental than kind of the sociolinguistics approach that I learned. But I think what I'm going to do is make some connections between what we've been calling social inaction, and I always like to kind of give a brief idea of what we're looking at with the term enact in the kind of general way I've been defining it, which is just taking a variations of the dictionary term and three meanings that you'll find. The first being performance. And so when you're looking at, in particular, people engaged in social interaction with each other, which some people might call conversation, the participants orient to each other on the basis of not reading each other's minds, but what they perform, what they do for each other, and figuring out what's relevant for each other as an audience, being an audience for the other, knowing that you have an audience and adjusting your performance to that. And that helps bring forth or enact the conversation itself, what the talk's about, what's relevant, categories of people, things, events, things you talk about, and really maintaining that and maintaining it as a mutual understanding. And that takes a particular sort of work. And then a third meaning is like to act from authority, or what I like to think of as warranting what people say, what they do, holding each other accountable for what, not just what people immediately did in the conversation, but to what anyone ought to know. Members of the same culture and social contexts in which they might be engaged with, and knowing what people generally do that manage conversation, and also the quality of their ongoing relationship. And that matters for what happens and what you see people do. These meetings have an impact that when I kind of brought them in, I was looking at the early work in, I would say the 90s. It was really starting to move into different ideas about cognition and how this inaction approach for the social domain works well as an explanation of the cognitive or domain, was kind of like inside the head level of experience, which of course has been a big area of research, in the 20th century for sure, and before then. So if we were to look at kind of your AI question, what is cognition? It comes up with the focus on information processing. So cognition, it could be defined as the mental processes involved in acquiring, processing, and storing information, which is usually framed in various functions like perception, attention, memory, reasoning, and problem solving. All of this being, of course, facilitated by the brain, but the idea is to have kind of this separation between neurons firing and what's being done, but still kind of under the head, our subjective experience and the things that produces subjective experience. And so, they might see as the social psychology side of this, they might use the term social cognition, the ability to perceive, interpret, and respond to social information. So it's, looking at the language, the talk, as kind of a symbolic representation, but it's really cognition that's working through and making sense of this. So you're taking that social domain and trying to take it back to what's underneath the hood. People have to recognize facial expressions, understand social norms, judgments about others' intentions, but really, how is this all a cognitive process? And so which is fine. It's fine to think about that. What I'm going to argue is that there's some problems with the assumption that it's simply an information processing machine that you're trying to figure out under the hood. A lot of the I think early ideas, but also a bit of the divergence in cognitive psychology in particular was stemming from the American pragmatism, especially in the U.S., obviously around the late 1800s to the turn of the century, which had ideas that really did inform a lot of the roots of cognitive science, but then kind of diverged at various points, especially getting into kind of the behaviorism model of psychology and cognition, and into early computer models where there's a bit of a divergence from philosophy, but pragmatism. But I think a lot of the pragmatism roots. I'm sorry, some of the for those who are seeing these slides, you can see as they were slapped together. There'd be a couple things that are odd, but I did want to, I've talked a lot about American pragmatism, haven't really gone into this history, so I just kind of grabbed a couple of the principles and some of the early practitioners where, as a philosophy, it was kind of focusing on, what this podcast has been calling practice. Practice in a sense is the practical and a way of framing truth, not as absolute, but what people do. Not a fixed quality, but rather something that involves, based largely on the usefulness and practical applications in real world situations. Because this was how you see people really orienting their actions.
Yeah.
Sense making, terms like that are you hear a lot these days. The pragmatism had to focus on both experience, kind of the phenomenology of experience as something to pay attention to, but also experimentation, the idea that as scientists we might experiment and try to understand what people do, but people themselves are experimenters. We generate hypotheses, we gain knowledge by prediction and continuous inquiry, testing what's real and adjusting our behavior on that behalf. So it's not just abstract reason like a bunch of math problems. It's really being in the world and trying to figure it out. So this gives kind of an anti-absolutism stance to pragmatism, and not really going right for universal principles, which is a real revolution from 19th and 18th century philosophy, not to be looking for absolutes, but trying to build a philosophy out of what people really do, or even other animals or the rest of the natural world. Where there's much more of a, knowledge is something that's flexible, context dependent, and built up. And also, I guess the idea of instrumentalism, ideas and concepts are tools for solving problems rather than reflections of this objective reality. So it's not that you have an idea that's just going to apply. What's it doing now and in this situation?
Right.
At the time, this was thinkers like John Dewey, William James, some of the other kind of first generation. Peirce is also
Charles Peirce.
Charles Peirce is one of the early pragmatists. They did bring in kind of the democratic and social engagement. Use this as a way of looking at democratic values, social progress, education, reform, those kind of things. So it had that kind of application. But a lot of it, and what I'll focus on is really kind of how it built into cognitive psychology. And William James being kind of the father of one of the fathers of psychology is cognitive, certainly one of the founders of cognitive psychology, especially initially, which is, again, not looking for, these kind of rational patterns, but, how, drawing on evolution theory and other discoveries of the mid late 1800s. What does this mean for behavior and subjective understanding? So it kind of had this functionalism idea of adapting to an environment, and also looking at taking seriously the phenomenology of cognition as we experience it. We experience kind of a stream of consciousness, talking to ourselves, but also having perceptions kind of coming in. So early on, an alternative to this stimulus and response machine idea, where really you're just looking at behaviors and you're assuming that there's a black box underneath that's making the connections and not worrying about the connections. That kind of right away started diverging from what James was trying to do, which was something more integrated, in what I'll talk about George Herbert Mead carrying on. And William James also brought in emotions, which also kind of disappeared a bit for a lot of cognitive psychology well into the 20th century, where, looking at how emotions really might fit the physiology of emotions mattering for perception, and as well as emotional interpretations and other actions. So, William James, there's certainly much more to be said from him. I spent less time really looking at his and Peirce and the other early pragmatists as I did with George Herbert Mead. Who I've done a couple. We've done a couple podcasts before. He almost always ends up showing up as in our talks, and I think we could regard him as a second generation. He was kind of a student and contemporary of James. He wasn't directly a student of James, but spent some time with him and John Dewey. But became did his own work, mostly at the University of Chicago, where he taught up to his death in, I think, around 1931. And we talked lots and lots about that. But a lot of the concepts that carried on in what we're calling this enactivist or enaction point of view for cognition are, you can really trace to Mead. Whether they were reinvented later on or actually cited Mead, they tended not to. But I think Mead had it. He had the idea of meaning. Like, what is meaning? Is it a program? He defined it as tendency to act. Really, this predictive aspect of incorporating into experiential learning. I mean, that's predictive processing, predictive nature of meaning is now very, very in vogue, even in neurophysiology. Looking at the act as hypothesis testing, and looking at how it's a sequential process. And it's not just simple sensory motor sequences, but something that could involve this back and forth building of an act that includes emotions and includes kind of top down, bottom up interaction, in elaborate, detailed ideas of self as both the process of the self, and the object that's experienced, which we've talked elsewhere as the I, the experiential subjective process of self, and the me, who we talk about, who we are in relation to others, on the basis especially of having the capacity to have language in the particular way humans do. Even being able to hear the sound of one's voice becomes evolved into something where the vocal gesture becomes its own domain of a social organization. So you can have the social object, the social act, all of it, though, approached as a process rather than just as a kind of a storage or holder of information. So, there's a lot of roots here. In our past episodes, we've talked about this, and what I want to do is kind of see how it connects to what's now called for what's been now referred to as 4E cognition, but also still has a lot of echoes in current social psychology, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, and also I think helped recover cognitive psychology from the detour that behaviorism really was in the early 20th century, right into the 60s and 70s. George Herbert Mead really had a head start on these essentials that then get reincorporated, and now people are treat it like they just discovered these ideas, but they're right there, and really started being found in neuropsychology, philosophy of mind, experimental approaches, even psychotherapy. There's lots of ways that these ideas were then both recognized and respected more. And there's lots of other areas we could talk about, but again, this idea of 4E cognition, I think this is where the people who we might call the keepers of inactivists approaches these days, they will usually invoke 4E cognition as where they're coming from.
I got to know what that means.
So let's look at it.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So
there it is.
Yeah. So what's the 4E? So these are, I think, coalescing around the mid 90s, early 2000s. And they were kind of framed as theories and approaches challenging traditional view, especially the mind or cognition, brain-based cognition as just that information processor, especially being this kind of brain-bound, self-contained unit that you can really treat as the black box that we're trying to figure out while ignoring the rest of the world, how people are in the world, social interaction, and other factors. So what the 4Es are that kind of build out this cognitive black box are the terms enacted, E for enacted, embodied, embedded, and extended. And I'll go briefly through some of these 4Es, and then we're going to add a couple more, actually. But
all right.
So enacted, now this is a term that I've kind of co-opted to some degree from what was perhaps more of a focused term originally, but it is one that I think largely comes from the work we had talked about in the past on self-organization and autopoiesis theory. So basically, the enacted means cognitive processes emerge through active engagement with the world, and so rather than just seeing passive processing inside the brain, cognition is seen as something dynamically enacted in real time by interacting with the surroundings. So it's a perspective of looking at action and behavior as it shapes thought. But what I've been trying to do is look at the importance of how do you actually do this? What's the method? We look closely at people engaged in social interaction, and then you can kind of see how moment action it may is built up and could conceivably be certainly building thought and internal experience. So this way of talking about an action does come from Francisco Varela, who I talked about originally, the Chilean, who's worked with the Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana. They developed the idea of autopoiesis as describing the self-organization of living systems like cells, and how, key part being through a cell or a simple organism's engagement with its world, it's building a distinction between self and other even by the mere fact of keeping its membrane intact, but letting in certain things that it needs, exporting things that it doesn't, that build up kind of entropy in a sense of waste. And, what does this mean for how we think of living things in a way that isn't quite a machine, isn't quite like a machine? And his Varela's later work with Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche in a book, 1991 book, Embodied Mind, was very influential in bringing the enacted term into cognition and also into the social, a bit into the social psychology world as well. But I'll talk a little bit more about some aspects of this book. But a quick example of enacted would be practicing golf. So practice. Doing a golf swing is really thinking by doing. It's being in the flow. It's not stopping and talking through your golf swing, because that's a good way to miss the ball. It's you're letting go, and it's that's one of many ideas of how we would think of like a real-time interaction with surroundings. It's a better way of figuring out how something like a golf swing might work at every level, from the brain to the social context. The next term, embodied, is comparable. It's the idea that the body shapes the mind, so it's not just the brain, but what the body is doing in the golf swing and any other sensory motor system. Your whole body, your physical form is there and influences how we perceive, act, and think. They get more and more ideas about this, like the bacteria in our guts may matter for how we think, but more directly, kind of the phenomenology of bodily experience can help things like spatial reasoning or even abstract thought that could be used as metaphors. So we have a lot of words, and this is the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson talked, I think, a lot about this in like some of their books, the metaphors we live by. The gesture used in talk at first is kind of adopted from gestures that might be used from animals, but eventually become part of talk and also part of spatial reasoning. Like we move our hands away from each other to be symbolic of, smaller or wider, becoming smaller to wider. But this actually becomes a reasoning that might be used in the etymology of words, like expansive or other metaphors. Taking the sensory motor way of phrasing the world and turning it into how we think abstractly. So, building from gestures, and it's also a way of thinking of another E, embedded. Cognition not occurring in isolation, but in constant interaction with a rich and structured environment. I've used the term domain to give the sense of an environment built up for the immediate context and relevance of where it's occurring. So, and there's going to be lots of contexts that are being in which you're embedded, and which will be enacted through the actions, so, the social, the cultural, and the physical. Again, all of these kind of feeding into the cognitive process, which can be thought of as both, kind of subjective experience and also what underlies subjective experience of things that we couldn't directly experienced, but have to be happening. And so you can sort of add in the embedded nature of like a gesture to look at how people might scaffold their talk into aspects of problem solving or decision making, kind of using the gesture. Certainly showing emotions in one's face matters, and in other ways of like looking together at certain things in one's room, or looking together at a metaphorical portrayal of shape or distance or other physical features, all of which become important for how one does decision making. There's lots of good research on looking at the subtle ways people do this. But Sean Gallagher is one of the authors that I think could be credited with doing some interesting work on sort of this embedded nature. He has a 2006 book, How the Body Shapes the Mind. So that's embedded, and then the fourth one is extended. And the extended cognition is an interesting idea. One of its early introductions was by David Chalmers and Andy Clark, and I think Andy Clark has extended this the most. Their 1998 book, The Extended Mind, where they're looking at how going beyond the biological body into the tools and artifacts and interactions we have with physical things in the real world, especially things manufactured by humans for a purpose, can perhaps be thought of as literal extensions of the mind, in a real interactive sense. Like your smartphone, it isn't in itself alive or biological, but the way we built it to interact with really is an extension of cognition. Or even like having a phone and then being able to do a search.
Yeah.
Your brain doesn't even say, what's the name of that restaurant? It just goes into a sequence of get the phone, Google it. There's the name of the restaurant. Here it is in space, represented on my phone. All of a sudden, your mind has been extended into being able to look around your environment, to being able to look anywhere and find directions and do everything else and make a reservation or order your food right from these artifacts we built. So Andy Clark's really making that argument of the extended mind as a real way of kind of evolving cognition into the way that we live in the world now. And in that sense, you have kind of a distributed system of things like problem solving or memory or decision making. It's not just like the sum aggregate of the people involved, but something that's really inherently dialogical, really involving people being able to use something like a meme on social media, in the sense that meme becomes its own evolving reference that influences lots and lots of people. And so that to understand the way people are influenced, you kind of have to include that social media meme as part of your explanation. So that's 4E. All of those become important to understand if you're trying to explain cognition, do experiments, figure out what people are doing. And I'll pause for questions. What we're going to do next is take the 4 E's into my enacted social action example that I bring in for every.
I recognize those people that you just put on an instant.
Yeah. So I'll keep going. I can see this is getting long. So
No, well, it's going
It's
all right. I mean,
it's a presentation. All right, so
something people should listen to.
yeah, and I thought I'd just make an exercise, as I like to do, is to say, okay, here's some neat ideas. Let's see if we can find them in real conversation. And so this is the one I use over and over because it just I guess if someone were going back over all of our YouTube playlists, they'll get to learn more and more about what you can do with a simple interaction where this is people sitting around at lunch at a little at their little consulting firm and also having their weekly standing meeting and putting together the agenda. And I'll just play it. Let's see. Hopefully I've set this up so that the audio will come over. Let's find out the hard way.
So, anything you guys want to add, or?
Backup tapes in the microwave.
Backup tapes and the microwave. Okay. I'm gonna put it up there, so you know,
So I won't keep playing it. I'll just kind of go through the sections and read them. Basically, in the room, there's for people listening, there's an old newsprint page on an easel instead of a screen, because this is back in 1995. So they wrote their agenda on an easel that everyone could see, and this was about adding some new items to it. And so, can we turn this into these 4E definitions? Cognition extending into the social domain. So in a sense, we could look at something like the meeting agenda. How is it being enacted? It's not just inside their heads. It's not an abstract concept, but it's something that they're building in real-time interaction for each other, and making it relevant to how this little exchange happens. So when Laura, who's facilitating the meeting, says, "So, anything you guys want to add?" And Natalie says, "Backup tapes in a microwave." Neither of them said the word agenda, but it's clearly they've oriented towards being about the agenda. So in a sense, that has been enacted into the scene, the agenda, and what they're doing is about that and not something else.
Yeah.
So, anything you guys want to add, or?
Backup tapes in the microwave.
Okay, so and so this is also sort of an embodied, not inside the brain. It's emerging into the interplay between their bodies and their experience of the world. So the agenda has this place on a newsprint stand. It's seeable. People have to kind of look at it, index it by gesture. At that moment, they don't necessarily. They can kind of glance at it. Some people in the room can't even see the agenda, but they know it's there. So it's both available, indexing by gesture, but also symbolically there by implicature. But it's definitely part of the experience of their world. It's also something that's embedded. It's building up as part of this constant interaction that they're doing moment by moment by their cues, kind of a scaffolding, understanding not just what is the agenda, but what they're talking about would have to do with the agenda and nothing else. So Natalie says, backup tapes in a microwave. Oh, backup tapes in a microwave. And then Laura says, backup tapes in a microwave. And Natalie says, mm-hmm. And so we've talked about this in the past as kind of a very structured question answer exchange, which I've described as dialogic syntax, following Jack DeBois' work. So the dialogic syntax means they're keeping that. Laura's keeping the very same words, and the only difference is using a question tone.
Yeah, just to confirm that that's what she.
Well, it could do a lot of things. It could matter. So it is like, do I understand what do you mean backup tapes in the microwave? What's the context? The context, they're it's in Laura's cognition what the context could be, but it's up to Natalie to show what is recognized and what's understood.
That's right.
And so Natalie says, and we talked about this before in the context about, did Laura want her to explain what about backup tapes and microwaves? But no, this is embedded into the starting of a meeting and framing of the agenda. So it's not a place where you would then talk about the agenda item.
No.
The understanding that's embedded in it is, we're going to talk about this later. And so they could work with that and make that happen for this interaction. And then the extended concept, I think we can use that easel with the agenda on the newsprint as an extended reference.
Yeah.
Laura says, "Are you going to put it up there so we don't forget?" She's like, there. She's externalized the cognitive storage of these two items so that they can refer to them later. Our human constructed world is based on this. So you can see it's very easy to kind of stick these ideas into real social analysis of social organization. But what I've been arguing is that researchers in sociolinguistics, I think, that I haven't found many who have applied this idea of 4E cognition into social analysis of social conversation or other linguistic things. I haven't really seen it done well. And what you can see is that you can easily take social interaction and find all those features in it.
Yeah.
That then maybe become a better explanation of cognition. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But I did want to mention, I have I think 2 episodes ago, we did an episode on John Vervaeke. And his idea of relevance realization. And I should have put a link here. But he did on one of his interviews, he talked about the 4E cognition. He added 2 more. He added 2 more E's: emotional and exactive. Just briefly, I think that they're good additions because cognition is laden with emotions, with affect. We care about certain information relationships, I often frame it as for social interaction being accountable, and that there are particular emotions in the family of shame and shame and embarrassment on the negative side, and pride and solidarity on a positive side, being real factors in cognition and perception and framing our behaviors that are underappreciated. Mm-hmm. And then the other term, exactive, he's referring to an interesting thing, that how it is that the brain and body parts have evolved for this purpose of speech, of social interaction. And once, George Herbert Mead, had the idea of animals using their vocal gestures and then hearing them, and then this helped evolve into speech. So this is an exactive process where once this works better for surviving in the world, there was this super rapid evolution of the brain, of the mouth, vocal cords and things like that, where where we became social interactive animals. And then also exactive can kind of get the idea of this idea of indexing conceptual spaces into words and symbolic, like forging, becoming kind of a conceptual navigation, conceptual metaphor for other aspects of navigating the world. we talked a little bit about this with Ian McGilchrist's idea of the left and right hemispheres of the brain, but I won't get into that. I think these two terms basically there are 6 E's to cognition. So maybe I'll start calling them 6E cognition.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Because those make sense, though.
Yeah. Yeah, so like the emotional aspect here in our example with Laura, she
Backup tapes and the microwave. Okay.
that little laugh came at a position where I've kind of argued that it's a bit of an accountability issue. There's a slight possible context for embarrassment in aspects of the social relationship where laughter really fits in. Pointing out the various unusualness of saying backup tapes in a microwave in themselves, they sound kind of weird unless you were talking about them in the context of agenda. So she's just not explaining it, but leaves it itself, and it's kind of a little bit of the accountability of not doing an account at that moment, and yet the other accountability of how one's not supposed to talk about meeting items at the beginning of a meeting, but wait till later. All these kind of are there, maybe in the emotional mix at this affect and cognitive level, where the laughter comes right in there, and it's very interesting in that sense.
Even Natalie, the way she said it, sort of softly, and then went right back to eating is sort of, I don't even know if this is appropriate for the agenda kind of thinking, maybe, but she puts it out there, and it gets work from there. So her emotions came in. And what's the exactive part of this, Dave?
The exactive example I could think of, I think it's more the subtleties, how things like eating, or eating is very, all animals eat. How is it done? If we really looked at it, how is her taking a bite done? In the timing, the bodily space, the gesture, fit into this exchange of pre-language things, not just having to occur within conversation, but maybe even in some cases done. For example, she's taking a bite while she's saying mm-hmm. And so that's another account for not going into it then. She's got her mouth full.
Yeah.
And Natalie has her mouth full. So yeah, all these real subtleties you can really look into.
Repurposing.
Yeah, embedded, in that sense. So yeah, so they're very useful ideas. I think they're ways of expanding how we can talk about and
even
analyze.
The person whose back is to the easel is looking down and eating as Laura and Natalie have this exchange. That sort of suggests in a behavioral way that she's not listening, but she's listening, but she doesn't want to get into it.
Yeah.
She wants to leave it up to the other two. So you just keep your head down and let them talk about it. So all these tiny little actions, the interactions, I guess now really justify that exactive aspect.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
So, I know we've been going long, but I wanted to kind of take it from here into another thing I was kind of obsessed with when I was working on all these ideas for my dissertation, and what I particularly drew from the inactive approach of Francisco Varela, Thompson, and Ross in their 1991 book, Embodied Mind. I think that's probably where I got the term inactive and inaction, because I don't think it was in their Maturana and Varela's earlier work. And so I was also kind of focused on one of their main arguments in this book, which I think frames the difference between the 6.4 or 6E cognition and prior approaches to kind of a simple information-based, more computational model of cognition, which they call the representation problem. And so this is just a quick quote. We propose from the book, we propose as a name the term inactive to emphasize a growing conviction that cognition is not the representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but is rather the enactment of a world and a mind on the basis of the history of the variety of actions that begin that a being in the world performs. And so this is what we've been talking about. What's the problem with representation? To do science of cognition and other fields is to kind of have to extract something into this more descriptive symbolic form. And the problem is when that extraction into the symbolic becomes basically what's typically called reification. I like to think of as when the representation of an interaction process is taken by the researcher or others to instruct as the instructions of what's observed, basically the computer program sense. Once you've kind of figured out what the formula is, that's the algorithm that's explaining people's behavior, and that's certainly the traditional behaviorism stimulus response model that dominate cognition. How do we get beyond that now that we know how rich and detailed 6E cognition has to extend the description into the world, into what you're seeing. And the idea is to be, the closer you are to what you're seeing, I think the better you can't always escape representation. Otherwise we're just playing the video in the room and maybe not even interpreting the video. But what we can do is more deep, embedded, embodied, enacted description as a researcher of especially the social domain. And then we kind of, in a way, solve the representation problem. And, I'll say a little bit more about that, especially in the context of a conference I went to a couple of weeks ago. But I've been talking a lot about the reification problem, especially in past episodes. Like DNA is a classic one where it originally was thought to be kind of a simple coding instruction of that, how cells and bodies are built. But now that it's understood better, it's really something that's much more embedded into something far more complex, where it's hard to even say that it instructs something because it's such top-down systems mattering for even reformulating DNA. It's much more about there's a general overall morphology to the body and the cell and what's being reproduced. In the last episode, I talked a lot about the reification of in quantum theory, the idea of Hilbert space, where it's really so much of especially the popular and kind of strange aspects of quantum theory are very much artifacts of starting with math and then eventually trying to put it into the real world. But most of the people who are best at quantum theory are best at doing math and not of explaining kind of the real ontological world. So you get a lot of things that are just artifacts of the math, such as entanglement, or maybe even the particle wave ideas in quantum theory, which some of the newer ideas I talked about last time, put a question to that. And similarly, social organization, I think, is really where we've been focusing on this. How do we not treat that as reification? So in my dissertation, I talk a little bit. I'll just go into it briefly because it's kind of academic-y, but the idea of doing close analysis, especially of conversation where it works well, is to produce what I call admissible descriptions. What they become as you look closely at interaction, if our job is to figure out cognitive behavior, what we're doing by looking closely at those little exchanges is coming up with an admissible description of this kind of private brain-based cognitive or embodied activity. So it lets us do something like not just treat cognition as a storage of instructions underlying talk. In that earlier definition I gave, it was that sense that, it's really the cognition that matters. No, it's certainly honoring that interaction, but in a way, I've made the argument, and I think it comes from the conversation analysis tradition, that in a way, you don't have to worry about cognition. Cognition, in a way, doesn't matter for explaining social inaction in the way I framed it. You can have a pure description that's just kind of a little bit of elaboration of what the people do in that exchange and similar exchanges, and maybe talk about patterns such as term taking or conversational repair method, things like that. But if you wanted to then take it back into the cognitive and even neurophysiological realm, you could start with these as the admissible types of representation that maybe you can then account for more with some of the other findings in cognitive psychology, experimental approaches, or neurophysiology. So we look at this social domain as an emergent performance of private domain sensory motor activities, sensory motor emotion activities, and how people use their cognition to orient to the immediate relevance for interacting with others. And so you can kind of come up with more of a description that becomes this coupling of public and private domain resources. And that's how I like to think of the job of looking at talk as enacted social action. And I won't go into too much about this. You could start then looking at talk by three areas that can then be maybe taken back to cognition, like the topical, what is talk about, really looking at how references are designed for others, these conversational dynamics that are themselves quite emergent and organized, really takes two people to maintain conversational turn-taking. Otherwise, it's one person telling a story or two people interrupting each other. There's lots and lots of dynamics about that the field of conversation analysis has outlined. And then relational is something that hasn't been looked at enough. Looking at the quality of the social bond, the emotions, special social emotions like shame and embarrassment, and how there's a constant relational stance and maintenance of social bond happening. All of these three can be found in close analysis of social interaction. All of them matter really for understanding cognition and even physiology and biology to extent.
Yeah.
In earlier work, I kind of break down social inaction into more parts, which I won't go into, but basically you could start breaking it down into actions of recognition, projection being it's very predictive oriented, but also prediction with assessment, interpretations of each other's acts, and adjustment, repairs of troubles, and accountability extending into these broader contexts, warranting what people do with each other and the emotional context of that. So I think you can use this 6E cognition through starting from initial social inaction and taking it into other domains. By looking at how people adjust to each other. The idea, if you're a researcher, is to think of admissible descriptions not as denoting internal mechanisms, internal representations, but connoting this kind of structural and coupling between private and social interface happening at that moment. And there's a big philosophy one discussion we can not get into, which would be, is there modeling going on in the brain? And you can argue different ways about that, but
maybe that's artificial intelligence.
Looking closely, we could do a lot more with really looking closely at behavior. I'll close out just for fun with a couple of slides that I think can look at maybe, this isn't precisely 6E cognition going back into other areas of science, but I think the general idea, which I think we could kind of frame as philosophical pragmatism and aspects of it, coming back into other areas of science. And in late May, I went to a conference. I was only able to go one day of a 3-day conference, but it was put on by Johns Hopkins University, their philosophy department. They have a particular department called natural philosophy, which looks at philosophy applied to different scientific and physical realms, such as quantum physics being one big focus. This was hosted by physicist Sean Carroll, who's has a popular podcast and a number of popular science books, but it is kind of a physicist with, I think, quantum physics focus, and Janine Ismail, who's in the philosophy department at Johns Hopkins, but I think also does a lot of philosophy of physics and other topics. They brought together a real interesting group, and I'll just kind of grab a couple of the speakers and some of their ideas, how it applies to what we've been talking about. One of the talks the first day was by Sandra Mitchell, philosopher of science at University of Pittsburgh, and she was invoking philosophical pragmatism as a way of framing, I think, what we've been talking about as representation and in a more grounded way in sciences. That being acknowledging more of the role of judgment in theoretical experimentation, inferential practices that researchers might use to warrant claims about nature or whatever it is they're looking at. She said our beliefs and theories are not mirrors of nature, like homeomorphism, structuralists, or propositional correspondence of the terms that make them true, but rather our representations are partial ways of characterizing aspects of nature that we have already carved out as our objects of representations. That's a more complicated way of saying, I think, what we've been talking about. But that, the idea of philosophical, kind of the American pragmatists and their legacy invites more of this thinking of science in this more interactive framework. And I think a lot of the speakers who were brought together for this conference did reflect this in different ways, even though they seem to be, like, a lot of them are fairly traditional in their approaches, and I think what I came away with was listening to those speakers was, when I was doing my dissertation, I was all gung ho on saying representation is evil, but it hurts science. But I think a more balanced sense of grounded representation is okay for science, and that theme was kind of coming up. A next speaker was Nima Arkani Hamed, who is a theoretical physicist. Well, I think one of the top current physicists in the world right now. He's at Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and he's does some fascinating work in quantum theory, field theory, string theory in the past. But one of his cool ideas, which I hope to understand one day, is something called the amplituhedron, which is it's getting real close to what might be the real world or ontology behind the quantum and all that stuff we were talking about in our last episode. But still, it is math. It is a reification. It is a representation. But he made a great argument. 3 cheers for shut up and calculate. So in the past, students in quantum theory would start thinking about what's this all mean, and their professors would say, shut up and calculate, because it's all in the math. And he's arguing that, okay, it's fine. It's great to have these kind of descriptive ideas about what's non-locality. You'll see them on YouTube, but what he likes is having the capacity to sit down and really turn it into real math. And that gives him a language that I wish I had, because I have trouble with long division, to really kind of, sometimes math descriptions are much better than symbolic ones, and they just won't do it. So it's sort of like, having a recording that you can look at and analyze. If you can then, do the math of coming up with better, quantum and other physics theories. I can't remember why I threw this in, but I think another, base physical level that I like to talk about over and over is the Markov blanket.
I was wondering if you can,
and the idea of
back in
what's the real base of representation. I think it's right down at this level of the autopoietic system, or the system in which the internal child systems have a parent system that is a surface, and it's this parent surface that meets the world, and the children's interaction is there to keep that parent going, but is in some ways irrelevant to how the parent meets the rest of the world, which is as an abstract representation, even if it's one cell in its environment or multi-cells. Markov blankets and Markov blankets, you start modeling the world, and blankets within blankets within blankets, you get levels of modeling of the world. We can question whether it's models is the best word, but I think the Markov blanket shows how what we're talking about for social interaction goes way back, even to perhaps the very origins of life. And there was a couple real interesting examples of super simple cognition. Nick Lane is a biochemist at University of College London, and he was looking at the origins of life, perhaps as soon as these very basic living systems were able to consume energy in a particular way, which is called the Krebs cycle, converting light-based energy into something that can keep a self-organizing far from equilibrium. As soon as that happened, he's thinking maybe this is almost at a point where we're at a kind of cognition, a metabolic type of cognition, because as the next level where you had mitochondria in a cell, you've got these groups of metabolism incorporated into one Markov blanket into another layer, and they're kind of interacting in a way that could be thought of as cognitive, and I think you can argue extends right into just a matter of complexity, where you start getting things like eyes and neurological systems and things to make more complex versions of the same thing that were happening right at the very origin of life. And so I thought I'd throw that in. And I'll throw in one more cool thing that we had talked about predictive processing back in the past. Biological engineer Malcolm McIver at Northwestern University, he you'll find on YouTube a number of his talks. He showed one where it gave a great illustration of how animals use predictive processing, using this clever way of how mice in a maze would have to run and hide from this little robot that would find it and shoot air at it it's frighten it. So it'd have to navigate through this environment where looking and peeking at where this robot might be. And so they've done all kinds of clever things to even like wiring up their hypothalamus to really show both in simulation and really evidence how this kind of represented world of the mouse is very much a sensory motor prediction that they have to kind of figure out and make less complex. So I'll show a quick video of it here if it works. Of course, now it's not working.
Oh no! you gotta arrow up there.
Basically, it had a neat model of how they could kind of frame where the mouse is looking and how predicting where the robot would be and kind of collapsing into the reality when it actually sees the robot. So, anyway, I think that's more than enough for now. But the idea of bringing those in is that I think as these really cool areas of science get more and more into clever ways of looking at cognition and physics and other aspects of the world, you can see this sense of the representation moving away from that simple models and assumptions and mechanisms of the world, and something that's much more closer to the 6E cognition and an active approach that we've been talking about, looking at practice, looking at how representations can be admissible, but to the extent that they can be demonstrated as practice behaviors, things that can be illustrated, and that these enactive principles illuminate better the social, cognitive, and physical domains, and that this really goes right back to American pragmatism philosophy as a real method of science, and not just a philosophy. And so that's what we had to say.
Well, it was on that last slide, Dave, where I read it as sort of the marriage of theory and practice, the interplay of theory and practice, but that practice cannot be separated and represented as something very different than the theories that people have, or the philosophies, or any other explanations of phenomenon. You have to get very close in, like you did in your research. Then you're going to see the interplay. And when you showed us on the segment of the meeting, the 6 E's, you could see, okay, that's happening, that's one E, that's happening, that's another E. And that's the way I think people ought to see their practice, as offer, in a way, their practice to a observer, a scientist, and saying, well, why don't you watch what I say and do with this coworker, and then we'll look at it together if you're recording it, and then we can talk about our emotions. We can talk about all the different things that you're seeing. That would end up, my sense of it, with a much better bond between the scientist observer and the participant. And Peter said very clearly in several of his conjectures that you really can't look at practice the same way as you would slicing something and putting it on a slide and saying, okay, that's what the phenomenon is. That you have to be in it, flowing with it, and then participate to its embodiment in order to really understand.
Yeah, but then Peter Vail was a practitioner of management, or management consulting, or and others in your field. So having to then translate it into the next, I guess at some point it's you're doing representation for others and making that matter is the next trick. So I think being having those six E's, understanding at least makes you a more rich practitioner if you're
Yes.
doing something like advising on
Yes, and I think
organizations.
you'd have more appreciation of yourself if you realize that in a successful conversation or successfully hitting that golf ball that was sitting there because you've been practicing it, that shows that you are a highly functioning species, which I think is a nice thing to know about ourselves. Anyway, this is an experiment in our in action of having, and Dave really, he has the slides when he's had other conversations, but this time we recorded them so that you can see them as he's speaking. And I think it's going to be very effective in catching up another moment of the process of our understanding practice, conversation, and how they're socially enacted.
But maybe next time I won't do a presentation first, change, and we'll have an actual conversation.
Yeah.
A little Q&A. That might be good too.
We should be the proof of our own pudding, shouldn't we? If we think conversation reveals things that otherwise we or no one else would know.
Yeah.
So let's look forward to that. And thank you again for your preparation and for your very clear understanding that you're sharing with us.
Great. Next time.
You were listening to the Practice Podcast, Conversations Probing the Nature of Practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Automatic, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again.